All right. Our next speaker is Gil Fellingham, who's a professor at Brigham Young University. He's also the current chair of the Statistics and Sports section of the ASA. His research interests include Bayesian and non-parametric Bayesian methods in health and human performance. He's coached water polo, swimming, and volleyball all at the collegiate level, as well as track and field at the secondary level, and has been a consultant for the national men's volleyball team and the Philadelphia Eagles of the NFL. Dr. Fellingham.
First of all, I'd like to thank Mark and Scott for putting this on. I think it's a great activity, and I'm really pleased to be involved with it. I would like to say, however, that when I first saw the schedule and I saw that I was the last speaker, I thought, oh great, I'm going to be talking to an empty room. This is perfect. I, however, did not account for the avidity of sports statisticians. You guys have hung around till 3 o'clock or whatever it is to listen to a talk about volleyball. Man, yeah, you got to have, I mean, way to go, guys. You got to, your lives are way screwed up. That's all I can say. I do, however, appreciate Mark and Scott putting the basketball panel discussion after me, which is kind of encouraging you guys to hang on. So thank you guys for that, at least. That's all right. I'm going to talk a little bit about some work I've done in volleyball, how it got started, and what we've done. None of this is real. I think on the edge, but I do think it's useful, and I think it leads to maybe some work that could be thought about in other areas. So there's some work with the men's team, national men's team, that we're going to present today. I know the abstract just says women's, but I'm going to do a little bit of the women's as well. I thought it would be more interesting to look at the whole scope and how it's led to some things that have happened in volleyball. The way this happened is I got to know Carl McGowan when I played a little bit for him a long time ago. Carl was the men's volleyball coach at Brigham Young University, and when I returned to BYU as a faculty member in the stat department, Carl called me and I got involved doing some coaching with him and working with the volleyball team. He's a real quantitative guy and very much motivated by science. And Carl was an assistant coach at the 2004 Olympics, and he contacted me early in 2004, actually late 2003, and said, we have limited time with the men's team as they come in to prepare for the Olympic Games. They come in, the games are in August. They could really get all their players together because of professional obligations about in June. They have like maybe 4 weeks of practice, then they have to go out and play some practice matches around, and they play. So his question was, what do we do? I got a month, I got maybe 20 practice sessions with these guys. What do we do to prepare them for the Olympics? So the notion is, what matters most? What skills should be concentrated on as they prepare to practice? The BYU women's team, and that's the women's part of this, sent me up some very similar data after the 2006 season and asked for kind of the same kind of what matters most kind of analysis. What should we be focusing on to get better? And they were particularly, and I was particularly interested in setting, because the men's team included no setting data. So I was interested in seeing how setting ranked up in terms of skill importance. But the basic issue is what matters most and how do we partition practice time. So this is a real problem, I think, in a lot of different areas. Every game is complicated. How do you partition your finite practice time to most reasonably get better? So one of the things about volleyball that is probably useful to understand is that volleyball has evolved through the years, and traditionally they keep data on every touch. There's a program that comes out of Italy called Data Volley, and you'll see, especially in international matches, somebody on the sideline with a laptop computer just going crazy. And what they're doing is they're typing the skill, serve receive, and a ranking for the skill, which is some symbol on the computer. Usually the scales are 0 to 4, and they're trying to keep track of everything as it goes on during the game. And they use those things in real time at timeouts to say, well, so-and-so's passing the 2.6, he probably ought to get out of there. Or so-and-so's hitting 140, maybe he shouldn't be playing, or whatever. So typically they keep a lot of data. So they sent us all the data from the 2002 World Championships and the 2003 World Cup, where they'd rated every skill for all those teams except setting, and traditionally setting doesn't get rated. So we had almost 22,000 observations from the men's team, and this included other, obviously, world-class programs. The women collected data from the 2006 season, and they rated every skill for the home games, and the reason they only used home games is because they had cameras set up along the net so that they could rate setting both from distance from the net and also behind the, typically in volleyball you film from behind the court, so they had the behind the court camera, which is always there, so you could rate setting along the net, and then they had a camera set up on the net to rate it in and away from the net. And so we had about 7,000 observations from BYU where they rated all those skills, and that was just BYU. So the question, so this notion is, how do we decide what matters most? And we decided in the limited amount of time we had that we would do a kind of a fairly basic idea. We would build a model, we'd associate a parameter with the skill, and then we'd call the importance score the expected value of the parameter over its standard deviation. The notion being that if it has a high expectation of having a good outcome, you would think it would be an important skill, but if its variance is high, maybe that makes it less important, maybe we don't spend as much time practicing. And the other notion is that we know we can get those variances down as we get more data, so the more times it happens, that makes it more important as well. So there's a couple of dimensions here that we're trying to increase this score, this importance score, along this very kind of simple notion. So we have each skill rated, and then the scale depends on the skill, 0 to 4, 0 to 5, something like that. So there are differences in the men's and women's rating systems that you'll see as I present some tables. And then settings only rated for women, and we also found that digging and blocking, the rating systems seem to be less consistent. So for the men, we had a real simple logistic model where we related the response to the skill ratings. So we looked at this log odds of ratio. So the betas are the effect of performing a skill, and we used a Bayesian approach to come up with the posterior distributions of each of these parameters. For the women, we did two things. So one of them, we did this same logistic regression, but instead of just having a single beta, we actually used the slope. So we've got these things rated 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's see if the slope is the thing. Is there a change in slope in terms of importance? So we actually use the beta 1s here as the thing that we use the parameter to try to get at skill importance. We did use Bayesian chi-square goodness of fit test to see that we did a reasonably good job of modeling the probability, but we based the importance score on this slope parameter. And the other thing we did with the women, which I think is the most interesting thing, and I think this is the one I would pursue if I were to continue on with this, is we viewed these sequences of events, and volleyball is a real nice way to do this, although I think it's probably true in other games as well. We viewed them as a Markov process. So if you think about a serve coming to a pass, going to a set, going to an attack, and you can, I think it's reasonable to say that the quality of the set probably is determined by the quality of the pass, but maybe not before that. The quality of the attack is based on the quality of the set, and so on. So you're building up these Markov processes, and we built this kind of huge transition matrix, some of which are constrained to always go to a good outcome. Some are constrained to always go to a bad outcome. But some were trying to develop these probabilities of what happens. So we had this fairly large transition matrix containing transitions from serves through passes, through sets, through attacks and digs and so on. And our outcomes here were the rally continues, a point for the home team or a point for the visiting team. The Markov model then is based on this multinomial likelihood and then we had a Dirichlet prior. So this is a nice conjugate kind of Bayesian model for those of you that are more statistically oriented than those who are more sports oriented. But anyway, I think it has some nice features. But the importance score, the beta here in this case, we did by looking at the unconditional probabilities. So say you make a 3-point pass, there's lots of different paths from that 3-point pass to an outcome. So at each draw, we looked at all the possible paths from that 3-point pass to the outcome, and we summed across those probabilities. So the importance score for the 3-point pass is this unconditional probability of a 3-point pass leading to a point. And so that was done in every draw of the MCMC code, and so we got posteriors on these betas that go all the way from whatever the touch was to the outcome. So this is importance scores for the men, and it's great. Table of numbers, way to go. Whatever time it is, 3:10, and you put a table of numbers on what kind of an idiot are you? What I want you to notice here, those of you that are still awake, is that the things that tend to stand out in the left column, which are the positive, productive, what do we call productive skills, are the attacks, the serve receives. Those are the things that seem to matter. And the things that seem to be really negative are serves, bad attacks, and serve receptions. So the thing that stands out in this table is that attacks matter for the men, and serving matters for the men, and serve receiving matters for the men. The defensive skills are not as important. So that led us to make some recommendations that I'll talk about in just a minute. For the women, so now we get to see the set coming up here, and I did set distance. We did it a bunch of different ways. I've got set distance here. So you've got the important scores. Passing seems to be very important, although it has a little lower expected value. It has a smaller variance, so a higher importance score. And then floats are more important than jump serves, and set distance is slightly above digs, but not as high as, say, passing. So now remember, those are the slopes. So the question is slope the right way to look at that? And I don't know that. I'm not sure, but that's certainly one way to look at it. And then here's the importance scores for the women for the Markov chain analysis. So up high, the thing I want to point out about this thing is how the number of occurrences comes into effect. So a 3-point pass has an importance score of 38. Now, of course, these scales are all different, so you can't go from one scale to another. Just ignore the scale, but just the relative rank. And a 4-point pass has an importance score of 36. Well, a 4-point pass is, in theory, a better pass than a 3-point pass. So why does it have a higher importance score? Well, it happens more often. You're more apt, you have more 3-point passes than you do 4-point passes in a match. So you have to, but here the expected value column really does make sense because it's the probability of earning a point. So a 3-point pass has a 50.5% probability of earning a point, and a 4-point pass has a 51% probability of earning a point. Now, and a 2-point pass has a 49% probability of earning a point, and a 1-point pass has a 36% probability of earning a point. Now, what does that tell you if you think when you're talking about the other model we did where we're relying on slopes? because it's essentially 1 point down here and then 2, 3, 4 up here. So there's not this kind of nice slope. It's just, I don't think we're rating. I think one of the things that we're probably not doing well is rating passing well. This would kind of, one of the things this table tells me is we're not rating passing well. So I want you to notice a couple of things. I want you to notice that, and these are things are rated essentially the same. A 5-point dig would correlate with a 4-point pass. I want you to notice how the digs are setting below the passes. So a perfect dig yields a point less often than a perfect pass. And that's consistent all the way down the line. And that's one of the things that jumps out at us. I also want you to notice that as the sets go back off the net, things don't work as well. So one of the things that made a difference here is the back row attack for women, maybe not something we want to be spending a lot of time with. So, what do we do? What did we say? Well, I wrote this letter back to Carl, and I said, here's what I think. Serve, serve, and serve some more. Spend your time serving. We don't serve nearly at a high enough level to compete with the teams we're going to be competing with in the Olympics. You got a limited amount of time, spend a lot of time serving. Now that means that you're also going to spend receiving serve more, and that's good too, because it's a very important skill. But make sure that your drills that you're using with your serving drills and your receiving serve drills don't limit your passers in terms of their serving. Typically, volleyball, if you're going out and you're coaching a team, typically you do this drill where you got people serving and people passing and you do this little circle thing. Well, that's great, except that you've always got your middles and your back row specialists or whoever, you got your middles and your right side hitters and your setters doing all the serving because they never pass, and these guys that your outsides are doing all the passing and they're going back to serve. I said, that's not a good thing. Get the outsides serving more because they're going to be important in the game as well. And I said in my report, I said weight serving more and blocking less when evaluating talent. Blocking didn't seem to matter. Your middle blockers are often on the floor because they block well, which is natural. Middle blocker, it even says blocker in the name of the position, but I said don't weight blocking as much. I think we're overweighting blocking and underweighting serving. These guys got to go back and serve. Make sure you got players on the court that can serve. Told them that based on the rating system, they could pass and set further off the net, get the ball off the net. The cost of an overpass is excessive. The cost of a 2-point pass is virtually nil. So why not keep the pass off the net and don't worry about that overpass and just play further off the net, and that in general better attacking outweighs better defense. So we wrote this report. I gave it to him, I don't know, May. It's dated May in my directories. So I wrote it in May. They got it in June. They started practicing. They had this kind of 1 month of practice, and they went to the Olympics. And this was 2004, so this was in Greece. So they were ranked 14th going into the Olympic Games. And I don't know if you guys don't follow volleyball, but they finished 4th. They were in the bronze medal match. So they felt like this was a good thing. So Doug Beal was the head coach at that point, and Doug retired, and Hugh McCutcheon became the head coach of the men's team in 2000 and after the Olympic Games, so in 2005. Hugh had played for us at BYU, so he took this information and kind of parsed it into his coaching, and of course in 2008 the men's Olympic team won the gold medal. Now, there's a few points I want to make about that gold medal match. One is that when Brazil showed up without their first setter, Brazil had clearly the best team in the world, and their first setter is clearly the best setter in the world, and in my mind, the best volleyball player in the world. But he had an ego tiff with the Brazilian coach, and the Brazilian coach said, "Okay, you can just stay home." And when he said that, everybody in the world said, "We got a shot." So you're saying we got a chance. Because now Brazil is all of a sudden moved back down to the level of everybody else. And so when we got in the finals against Brazil, it was like, we got a chance. We can beat these guys because they don't have their good setter, who is a master at moving the ball around the floor and always hits his hitters on stride. The other thing I want to mention is that while I said that you should use setting to evaluate and setting more and blocking less to evaluate who stays on the floor, that morphed into, use serving more and blocking less. It morphed into, let's use serving more and ability to hit a quick less. Clay Stanley, I don't know how many of you guys watched the volleyball in 2008, but Clay Stanley, who's a fabulous server and a very strong hitter, cannot hit a quick. Now, Clay plays on the right side, and for 2 years they tried to force Clay to hit the quick, and he couldn't do it. So they finally decided, you know what, we're not going to force him to hit the quick. We're just going to throw the ball up there high, let him hit high, but we're going to have him on the court to serve. And I don't know if you remember the matches as the United States marched through, but in virtually every match, Clay Stanley served 3 or 4 or 5 points in a row at critical points of games. And the U.S. goes on and wins the gold medal. So having Clay on the court, I think, was a huge plus for the men's volleyball team. Now for the women, this is at a different level, of course. The men are playing a different game. One of the first things you notice is the men and women play a different game. I've told them you got to practice your transition offense, because if you're making the same pass to a setter and siding out less, your hitters aren't getting back into the attack. So your transition offense is not as good as it ought to be. So I've told them to work more on transition offense. I've told them to hit a float serve, preferably to a jump serve. I don't know, I'm not talking to maybe great volleyball aficionados, but a jump serve is, you go back, you throw the ball up, and you crack it. And the men can do that and hit it hard enough that it really becomes an offensive threat. But even at fairly high levels of collegiate volleyball, intercollegiate volleyball, women just don't hit the ball hard enough for that to be as big a threat. And it turns out for the women, it's better to hit a jump serve. A jump serve is hit to knuckleball and move rather than try to just overpower. And I think the data kind of shows that to be true. So forget the jumpers. I know that maybe you got girls that want to do this, but forget the jumpers and teach them to hit float serves. And again, keep the pass off the net. Again, because of the penalty and overpass, which is huge. And you saw the 4-3-2. It doesn't matter much where the pass is relative to your offense. And get the back row offense out. Now, I'm not sure I would say these same things at a national level, because the national women play a game that's different than high-level university even. So it may be different. But I will say that the volleyball team has virtually eliminated their back row offense this year. And they move their passes back, they're jump serving more, they're spending more time. So they're at least doing what I said I think they ought to do. Whether or not it's going to help, it's hard to say. So overall, what does this tell us about volleyball? Well, the men's game and the women's game are different, and I think that's true. But I think that we've got this mentality that it's the same game, we got to do the same things. And I think that's a mistake. So the men's game is this power game. It's about attacking and being able to receive serve. The women's game is about being able to dig and do transition things. They have many longer rallies. Now, turns out that in a couple of weeks, Doug Beal is going to a conference with the FIVB, and they're going to talk about changing the rules in volleyball. And I don't know how it's going to come out, but the rule change that's on the table is that you have to hit a back row attack on the first swing. So when you pass the ball, your first attack has to be out of the back row. And that's very much because the men's game, just the rallies are terminated, right? It's pass, set, boom, we're done. So in order to increase rallies, the FIVB is studied this notion of let's force everybody to get out of the back row on the first hit. And my opinion is, after looking at a bunch of data, is that will not change the men's game a whole lot. They'll run everybody out of the back row and it'll be just fine. My notion is the hitting window for a front row and a back row set in the men's game changes about that much, whether you're hitting from the front row or the back row. Because if you're hitting from the front row, you don't want to get too close to the net, because these guys, they got their pits over the net. They're doing this on the block. 6'9", these 4-foot-long arms, and they're reaching here to block. So you don't want to put the ball on the net anyway. It's like hitting in a phone booth. Get the ball off the net, give the hitter a range to hit. So I don't think the front row and the back row makes a whole lot of difference. I don't see that changing the men's game much. I do think it will change the women's game, and I expect it to change particularly the collegiate game, if that rule percolates down to the NC2A, because then now you don't have people that can hit out of the back row as well as they can hit out of the front row. I think the libero, which is the player that comes in and just plays back row, is very important for the women, but less so for the men, and utilized exactly the same way, by the way. At all levels, this is kind of this notion of, guy on first and nobody out, we're going to sacrifice. Have we been thoughtful about how to use the libero? And for the men's game, you want to have somebody that can hit out of the back row. And having a libero in there that's passing and playing defense for the men is certainly, if you got a Rich Lamborn, who's been the United States libero for a while. Rich also played for me at BYU, who is the best passer that's ever lived, I think. Then you get him in the game because he's a fabulous passer, but he can't attack. And you want people in the game that can attack, because that's where you live and die with men's volleyball. Women, on the other hand, it's a defense game, and you want people in the game that can dig and get the ball back. It's a transition game. So one of the things I've told people that have read some of this stuff is, I know, and I say this to women's coaches because I think they're recruiting wrong, I know that you can't coach height. I understand that. But you also can't coach quickness. And women's volleyball coaches tend to recruit, and I've seen this happen over and over again. Coaches call me all the time and tell me, I got this 6'2" girl, and she really crushed the ball, and on and on and on. And I say, well, tell me about her foot speed. Oh, she's a little slow. I don't think she's the right. I think you're better off with a 5'7", 5'8" girl who's quick, who can transition, who can pass, who has a more complete game than you are with this big girl who's a little bit slower. The women's game is different than the men's game. And treating the women as if they are men is not optimal in my mind. So I've told them that. So I did this for volleyball, but I think it's applicable to a lot of sports. And I thought about this for golf. Every shot, leading to every other shot. You got different, this is the drive for show, putt for dough thing. We all know, at least that's the mantra in golf, that it's your ability to pitch and putt that makes you win in golf. But I think we can do this important score thing. I think you can tell. I think it's true for individual golfers. Just like volleyball is different between men and women, golfers have different importance scores on different clubs, and they ought to be practicing different clubs a different amount. And to me, it just makes sense. You have to have the data. Basketball, I think the same thing is true. Football, you could talk about this. One of the things we did for the Eagles was try to establish this most important position thing. We talked to him about what's the most important position. And Andy Reid says, you ask him to rate his positions, and he says quarterback, cornerback, left tackle, Okay, those are his three. I think those are the three he told me. I can't remember now, but So I've said, so we did this thing on the offensive line, and we did our best with the data they had. We tried to rate, give importance to various positions. And we went back into Andy at the end of doing this stuff, and we did stuff, and we said, Andy, I know that you're not going to like this, but it certainly appears to us that your most valuable, your most important lineman is your center. And he looks at us, like, you guys are idiots. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. He says, that guy, he can hardly walk. He's just out there. He's kind of a placeholder. I don't have anything invested in him. And so we said, well, Andy, doesn't he call your blocking schemes? Well, yeah. Well, it appears to us when he has a good game, you guys win a lot more. And when your left tackle has a good game, it really doesn't impact it that much. So you ought to think about the guy that you got coaching on the field. And and that went to the same thing about, well, if he's calling line blocking, then what about my defensive? Is the cornerback really my most important player on the field? Or might it be the guy that's calling my defensive signals? Or the guy that's adjusting after the offense comes to the line of scrimmage? This whole notion of we value what we rate, left tackles became important because we started to rate sacks. Sacks became important because of Lawrence Taylor, so now we rate sacks, now we grade sacks. Well, are they really that important? Or are there other things we ought to be rating? And I think there's work to be done on this notion that we establish what's important. We talked about numerical guys getting built into what we think the model ought to be. And we do the same thing. Are we really grading what matters, or are we just responding to current thinking? Anyway, I think there's some ways to do that in optimal lineup as well. I think I'm done. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and I can tell you that passing right now that the serving is rated on the quality of the pass. Guy makes a great serve, the passer dives out and makes a perfect pass. The serve gets a low rating, and I think that's silly. I think that you have to have an independent way to measure, and I agree that it's tough. If the batter looks silly, then that's probably a good way to rate a changeup. But my sense is that, and I've had this discussion with football coaches as well. There is this notion that you have told a player to do something. This is what you've asked him to do. Is he doing what he's been asked to do? And if he is, then he ought to get a certain grade. And if if you've told him to serve the seam and he serves the seam, that ought to be a good grade. If you've told him to serve this high outside seam, then whatever the passer does, then that ought to be graded better. And I agree that's tough, but I think you can do it. I think you can start thinking about what have I done, and this is this interaction that we have with the coaches. And I think that, unfortunately, we don't get a lot of interaction with the coaches. But I think that's the interaction with the coaches. What have you asked the left tackle to do on this play, and did he do it? And if he did, then he ought to get a good grade. And if he didn't, and the speed rusher fell down and didn't get to the quarterback, you shouldn't be giving the left tackle a good grade. I mean, he screwed up. His footwork was screwed up. Let's give him a bad grade and try to take those into account independently. I think it's an excellent question and a very tough problem.